Hey folks. So I want to talk about a figure in the history of American communism named Earl Browder. Earl Browder is, you could look at him and see, he was probably the figure in the American Communist Party and the American Communist movement that you could most clearly pin on the label of crooked politician. Machine boss, party boss, corrupt, scheming, maniacal. Earl Browder has that reputation in the history of American communism. And, he was the general secretary of the Communist Party for many years until ultimately getting kicked out in 1945. So I want to talk about Earl Browder and who Earl Browder was. Now, Earl Browder was from Kansas, a rural state in the United States. His father and his brothers, they all joined the Socialist Party. And when World War I broke out, he and his brothers refused to fight, and their father encouraged them to refuse to fight in a boss's war. They were interested in socialism. And so he and his brothers from Kansas all went to federal prison for not fighting in World War I and refusing to fight on the grounds that it was a capitalist war. When Earl Browder got out of federal prison, he became an activist. He was in the trade union movement, and he was an accountant. He actually, I believe it was because he was in federal prison, he was able to start, learning to be an accountant, eventually finished his degree, and he became an accountant. So he didn't have to work that much, and he was an activist in the labor movement, and he supported himself by being an accountant. The Communist Party was formed. He was in the Communist Labor Party, eventually the Communist Party, when it was unified. He was a leader of it, and up through the 1920s, he was a leading figure in the Communist Party. And at that point, the Communist Party had a lot of members that were immigrants, people from Eastern Europe, people from Russia, people from different parts of the world who didn't speak English, had foreign language federations. Well, Earl Browder was from Kansas, the heartland of the United States, and so the Communist International encouraged people like him to take leadership roles because they wanted to kind of get rid of this belief that the communists were foreigners, were foreign agents, right? So Earl Browder, he's got an English Anglican name, he's from Kansas, farm boy. They wanted Earl Browder to be the leader of the Communist Party. The other prominent figure from that period was William Z. Foster, who was an Irish Catholic born in Philadelphia. So, these two guys, even though the Communist Party's membership was mainly immigrants, they also had a lot of African Americans during that period, but they wanted to just appear as just mainstream, wholesome American as they possibly could be, so Earl Browder moved up. Now, William Z. Foster, who was the prominent leader of the Communist Party, he had a heart attack during his 1932 presidential campaign. So after that, you saw Earl Browder kind of step up into the leadership of the Communist Party. And Earl Browder, he was a very effective speaker, a very effective writer, and he wrote books in line with the Communist International's perspective. And when it was time, when the communists were forming what they called a popular front, Browder went along with that. He'd previously said that Roosevelt was a fascist and called for class independence and, said that the Socialist Party were the blood enemies of the Communist Party. But when, in 1935, the Seventh World Congress happened, Earl Browder went along with it, and he wrote a book that's actually very interesting. It's called Why Communism by Earl Browder. And you read it, in the first essay is really compelling because you have Earl Browder making the case that if you're really a patriotic American, you should join the Communist Party, that they're the most patriotic group of people, they're the most loyal, most, flag-waving, true patriots. He actually says in there what became one of his biggest slogans. He said, communism is 20th century Americanism, and that if Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington were alive today, they would be members of the Communist Party. And this kind of rhetoric, which was encouraged by the Communist International, that was kind of Earl Browder's, it became to be kind of his, what you might call his trademark. But the whole Communist Party went along with it. The feeling was that, the communists shouldn't look like they're agents of some foreign power, and they should play up, the domestic progressive struggles. And so Earl Browder, he did that very, very well. He was the Communist Party presidential candidate in 1936, and in that campaign, he told his members, not to vote for him and to vote for Roosevelt. He said the essence of the Communist Party campaign was to defeat the Republicans. So, he ran for president, and, they in states that were definitely going to go for the Democrats, the communists voted for him. He got loads of votes. This was a time when the Communist Party was very big. I mean, there's video of him speaking to huge crowds at Madison Square Garden at communist rallies. They've got, Abraham Lincoln next to Lenin. I mean, the Communist Party was a big faction, and they were part of the Roosevelt wing of American politics. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president of the United States, and he was, favoring an alliance with Britain against Nazi Germany, the Communist Party supported that, and the Communists were part of the Roosevelt wing of American politics. But Earl Browder, he had some opposition within the Communist Party. Most of the communists favored forming a farmer labor party or an independent party that would actually support, would be part of the Roosevelt coalition, but it would be independent. Roosevelt said that he was a Democrat, but the communists felt like they needed to form a farmer labor party or a socialist party that would be independent of the Democrats, that would push for more socialist politics. Well, Earl Browder didn't think that. He argued that instead of a popular front, they should have what he called a democratic front, and they should support the Democratic Party, and they should not try to push for the independent Farmer Labor Party or some independent party like that. But Earl Browder, he was a little more Democratic Party oriented than most communists were. He was a little more leaning toward recruiting intellectuals and artists, and not focusing on industrial workers. But if you read Earl Browder's writings, he was following the Comintern line. And when in the fall of 1939, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and you had the Soviet Union entered a non-alliance pact with Hitler. You had Earl Browder change his position. And instead of supporting Roosevelt, he said Roosevelt was a warmonger, and he wrote this book for his 1940 presidential campaign called The Way Out. And in it, he's supporting Puerto Rican independence. He's saying that Roosevelt's a warmonger. He's changed his position, and he's once again, taking what you might call an ultra-left position, and he's emphasizing pacifism. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union's invaded, and when Pearl Harbor happens, Earl Browder flips his position again, and he's a big supporter of the Second World War. Earl Browder was, he was the top boss of American communism. People say he was pretty ruthless in suppressing people in the party. He actually tried to kick out William Z. Foster, who was just, the most wholesome, most beloved American communist. He was pretty corrupt, but the problems started during World War II, and what you might call Browderism, which became, his staple, his trademark, and ultimately his downfall, started during the Second World War. And during the Second World War, Earl Browder basically took the position that the USA should not have a communist party any longer. That in order to support the war effort, the Communist Party should dissolve. So in 1942, they had an emergency convention of the Communist Party in Madison Square Garden, and they dissolved. And William Z. Foster, this prominent leader of the American Communist Party, was opposed to it. And so just to stick it to him, Earl Browder makes William Z. Foster get up and announce that the Communist Party is being dissolved. It was that kind of mean-spirited, power play that kind of defined Earl Browder. So the Communist Party dissolved, and they became the Communist Political Association. And then when you had the Tehran Accords, when, Winston Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin met in Tehran and discussed their post-war plans, Earl Browder got really excited, and he wrote this book called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace. And he said that even after the war, there should be no more strikes. He said that basically the Soviet Union and the United States would enter a post-war alliance, and they would go around the world defeating fascism, and that the Soviets would adopt some of the American methods, and the Americans would adopt some of the Soviet methods, and they would just find this happy medium between capitalism and communism. That was Earl Browder's kind of vision, and he was putting this forward. And as the Cold War was beginning, as the Second World War came to an end and the Cold War was beginning, he had been so effective in mobilizing the Communist Party to support World War II and to support the fight against fascism. Figures from the Roosevelt administration actually approached Earl Browder and offered him the position of being Secretary of Labor. So Earl Browder was very excited. He was thinking he was going to be the Secretary of Labor. He had dissolved the Communist Party. It was the Communist Political Association. The Daily Worker newspaper was urging people to just be patriotic and support the war, and as all of these things were happening, the Cold War was beginning to start. And as the Cold War began, all of a sudden, Earl Browder began to realize that the trajectory of his alliance, his cozying up with the Democratic Party and with the Roosevelt administration, was suddenly at odds with his position as the leader of the Communist Party and the representative of the world communist movement. So it came time where the Communist Party had to shift its position, and the Communist Party had an emergency convention. and refounded itself. And they stopped being the Communist Political Association. They became the Communist Party once again. They said that U.S. imperialism was the main enemy of humanity, and Earl Browder wasn't going to go along with that. Earl Browder was committed to this vision of the Soviet Union and the USA merging, and this kind of communism as a wing of American capitalism. And so when that happened, Earl Browder was kicked out of the Communist Party with a few supporters. And the Communist Party then had what they called the anti-Browder campaign. And they talked about how, during the Second World War, the USA had been, very imperialistic to Latin America. And there had been some leaders in Latin America, figures like Juan Perón and the Brazilian President Vargas, who maybe they were sympathetic to fascism, but that was on the basis of being anti-U.S. and being, more nationalistic. And that position of opposing these nationalist leaders in Latin America wasn't correct. Earl Browder had said that black people did not constitute a nation. And that they were not an oppressed nation. And so the Communist Party, they said that there was a black nation in the United States. And in the final years of the Communist Party, the period following the Second World War, Earl Browder, he was just considered, the enemy of the Communist Party, because he, during the Second World War, had basically tried to maneuver the Communist Party into being a wing of American capitalism and American imperialism. And when the Soviet Union didn't want that anymore, he wasn't willing to flip his position back. So, Earl Browder, there was a lot of Communist Party folks who just hated Earl Browder. He was seen as just this corrupt, mean-spirited guy. People would be kicked out for disagreeing with him. He was cozying up to Hollywood, cozying up to these intellectuals, and he was just hated. And when he went down in 1945, when he was kicked out, ultimately, there were a lot of people in the Communist Party that had these long-standing grievances against him, just for being a corrupt figure, for being tyrannical, and when it got down to it, for being just kind of opportunistic. Now, it's interesting to note, so he got kicked out of the Communist Party, but they did give him a job. The Soviet Union gave him a job, and he was the editor and the bookseller of their American books. They had this thing called Progress Publishers that printed Soviet books in the United States and distributed them. So Earl Browder was he had to register at the State Department as a foreign agent, and he became the Soviet Union's book dealer until he died. And he had a magazine called Distributor's Guide, and he was the Soviet Union's book dealer. And interestingly, his grandson, Bill Browder, is now a big figure in American politics. Why? Well, Bill Browder, he grew up in a household where they spoke Russian, and when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, Bill Browder was a hedge fund manager, and he went over to the Soviet Union, and he worked with BP, and he had an outfit called Hermitage Capital Management, and basically he was with BP and the American and British companies that were looting the Soviet Union in the fall of the Soviet Union. And when Putin came in and started creating Gazprom and Rosneft, these two gigantic corporations that have kind of rebooted their economy, they're state-run corporations, he was opposed to it. And he worked with BP, and he called himself an activist shareholder, was trying to demonize them. So Bill Browder ultimately had to flee the country. And in Russia, he's been convicted of tax fraud. Bill Browder apparently defrauded the Russian government of millions of dollars. He committed tax fraud, but now that everyone's hating Russia, Bill Browder has testified before Congress. You'll see Bill Browder on CNN, denouncing the Russian government and acting like he's an expert on Putin. And this is the grandson of Earl Browder, the renegade leader of the Communist Party, who ended up getting booted out when the Second World War came to its close. So that's who Earl Browder is, and it's very interesting. And, people will make reference to Browderism. And, Browder was a very effective speaker. He was a very effective writer. But ultimately, when the time came, when the alliance between the Soviet Union and the USA ended at the end of the Second World War, Earl Browder wasn't willing to flip. He wasn't willing to go along with it. And he ultimately was loyal to American imperialism. And that's the essence of what Browderism is. A lot of people think if you talk about American patriotism and socialism, or you want to play up the American aspects, that makes you a Browderist. No, the Communist Party was very clear about what Browderism is. And Browderism was a deviation that dissolved the Communist Party, that wanted to end strikes permanently, that thought American imperialism was progressive in Latin America. That's what Browderism is. The Communist Party waged an anti-Browder campaign after his downfall. It's an interesting thing to note. Earl Browder's an interesting figure. I think I'm going to do more videos on some of these historical figures in American communism. They're all kind of interesting, and there's something you can learn from all of their lives.